Eleanor Whitmore stood before the Duke of Ashbourne, with her right hand pressed flat against her skirt, and before she could finish her rehearsed apology, he stopped her with a single question that had nothing to do with her brother's disgrace. "Why do you hide your hand, Miss Whitmore?" The words landed like a slap. Eleanor had spent the entire carriage ride from her family's crumbling estate rehearsing lines of contrition, phrases her father had drilled into her about honor and shame and the terrible thing her brother had said about the Duke in front of half the county. She had not prepared for the Duke of Ashbourne to look past all of it and fix his gaze on her gloved fingers instead. "Your Grace," she said, straightening her spine, "I have come on behalf of my family to offer our sincerest regret for the words my brother spoke against you. He was foolish and drunk, and he does not represent the true feelings of our household." Sebastian Ashford did not sit. He stood near the tall windows of his study, the gray morning light falling across a face that the county described as cold, unreadable, carved from stone. Eleanor had heard the rumors before she ever arrived. They said he had not smiled since his engagement ended 3 years ago. They said he trusted no one, least of all young women sent by desperate families hoping to smooth over old insults. "I did not ask about your brother," he said. "I asked about your hand." Eleanor's fingers curled instinctively tighter into her palm, though the glove hid whatever there was to hide. "It is nothing that concerns your Grace's business with my family." "Perhaps not." He crossed the room slowly, each step measured, and stopped close enough that she could see the faint scar above his own left eyebrow, a thin white line she had not noticed from a distance. "But you flinched the moment you stepped through that door, and you have kept that hand angled away from me since. A person does not do that over nothing." She wanted to leave. She wanted to turn on her heel and walk straight back through the halls of Ashbourne, past the portraits of stern ancestors, out into the carriage that waited to take her home to a house already drowning in debt and disgrace. But her father's voice echoed in her mind, warning her that the family's last shred of standing depended on this apology being accepted, and accepted well. "My brother's insult was unforgivable," she said instead, forcing the conversation back to safer ground. "He called you cruel and unfeeling in front of Lord Pembroke and half the assembly. He had no right. My father sends his deepest apologies, and begs that you consider the matter closed, for the sake of 2 families who have been neighbors for 3 generations. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Something flickered behind his eyes, something that was not quite anger and not quite amusement, but a kind of sharp curiosity that unsettled her more than hostility would have. "Your brother is a fool," he said finally. "That much is true. But I did not summon you here to hear an apology repeated a dozen times before you arrived. I summoned you because your father wrote that his daughter would come in his place, and I wished to see for myself what kind of woman would be sent to answer for a man's foolish tongue." "And what have you decided, Your Grace?" "That you are hiding something, and that it frightens you more than I do." Eleanor's breath caught. She had not expected honesty from him. Not this directness, not this willingness to say aloud what most people only whispered behind fans and closed doors. The Duke of Ashbourne was known for many things, but plain speech was not one of them, or so she had believed. "You are mistaken," she said, though her voice wavered just enough to betray her. He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a man might study a puzzle he intended to solve. "I rarely am, Miss Whitmore, but I will not press you further today. Sit, if you please. I find I am not yet finished with this conversation, and I suspect neither are you." She hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the strange pull of his attention, a pull she could not name and did not trust. In the end, she sat, perched on the edge of a velvet chair near the fire, her gloved hand still pressed against her skirt. "You must think me strange," he said, taking the chair across from her, "asking about a glove within moments of meeting you. But I have learned to notice what people try to hide. It has served me well, and it has cost me dearly." "Cost you how?" A shadow passed over his face, there and gone so quickly she nearly missed it. "That is a story for another day, perhaps. Today we are discussing your family's debt to mine, and the small matter of your brother's tongue." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with humiliation at the mention of debt, though she kept her expression steady. Everyone in the county knew her father had borrowed against the estate 3 times over, that the Whitmore name survived now on little more than pride and the goodwill of neighbors who remembered better days. Her brother's drunken insult had threatened even that goodwill, and now she sat in the study of the very man they could least afford to anger. "What reparation does your Grace require?" she asked, bracing herself for the answer, half expecting him to demand money her family did not have, or land they could not spare. "I have not decided," he said. "Perhaps I shall require nothing at all, or perhaps I shall require your continued company, so that I might satisfy my curiosity about the young woman who arrived here trembling and left, I suspect, just as composed as she entered. You wish me to visit again? I wish to understand why a woman sent to grovel on her family's behalf carries herself like someone accustomed to far greater trials than an angry duke. His gaze dropped briefly, deliberately, to her gloved hand. I think there is more to you than an apology, Miss Whitmore. And I find myself unwilling to let that mystery go unexamined. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had come to Ashbourne Hall expecting cold dismissal, perhaps cruel words, certainly nothing more than a single uncomfortable hour before she could return home and put the whole ordeal behind her. She had not expected a duke with sharp eyes and sharper questions, a man who seemed to see straight through the careful composure she had built over years of practice. I do not know what your grace imagines he sees, she said carefully, but I assure you, there is no mystery. Only a family trying to survive a difficult season, and a daughter trying to help however she can. Difficult seasons do not usually leave scars, he said quietly. The word struck her like ice water. She had not said scar. She had not confirmed anything at all. Yet somehow he had guessed at the truth beneath the glove, the truth she had spent years hiding from suitors, from society, from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about the marred skin along the back of her hand and up toward her wrist. I should go, she said, rising abruptly. I have delivered my father's apology. I trust that satisfies the obligation. It does not, Sebastian said, rising as well, though he made no move to stop her. But I will not keep you against your will. You are free to leave, Miss Whitmore. I only ask that you consider returning, of your own choice, when you are ready to speak honestly. And if I never am ready? Then I will have learned something about you regardless. Silence often tells more than words. Eleanor gathered her cloak, her hands trembling despite her effort to appear calm, and made her way toward the door. She paused there, her hand on the frame, and glanced back at him one final time. Why does it matter to you? She asked. My hand, my past, whatever you imagine you have seen. Why should a duke concern himself with the secrets of a ruined family's daughter? Sebastian's expression softened, just slightly, into something almost gentle. Because I have spent 3 years hiding my own scars behind polite conversation and cold reputation, Miss Whitmore, and I recognize the look of someone doing the very same thing. She left without answering, her mind spinning as the carriage carried her away from Ashbourne Hall and back toward the fading grandeur of her family's estate. She told herself she would not return, that the Duke's strange interest was nothing more than idle curiosity from a man with too much time and too little else to occupy his thoughts. But that night, lying awake in her narrow bed, she found herself removing the glove she wore even to sleep, staring at the raised, uneven skin along the back of her hand, remembering the heat and the smoke, and the small weight of a child pulled from the flames 3 years before. She had told no one the full truth of that night, not even her own family, who preferred to remember it as an accident that ruined the East Wing, rather than the desperate rescue it had actually been. She wondered, with a fear she could not quite explain, what the Duke of Ashbourne would do if he ever learned the truth. And beneath the fear, quiet and unwelcome, she felt something else entirely, the faint, dangerous flicker of wanting him to ask again. 3 days later, an invitation arrived at the Whitmore estate, sealed with the Duke's own crest, requesting the pleasure of Miss Eleanor Whitmore's company for tea at Ashbourne Hall. Her father, desperate to preserve whatever fragile peace had been achieved, urged her to accept at once. Eleanor stared at the letter for a long time before she finally broke the seal, her heart caught somewhere between dread and an emotion she refused to name. She would go. She told herself it was only to protect her family's name, only to ensure the Duke's goodwill remained intact. But as she folded the letter and pressed it against her chest, she knew, with quiet certainty, that this was only the beginning. Her father read the invitation over her shoulder, and let out a breath of relief that seemed to shake loose years of worry. You see, he said, pacing the small parlor that still bore water stains from a roof they could not afford to mend. The Duke is not so unforgiving after all. Perhaps your brother's foolishness will not ruin us completely. Eleanor did not share his relief. She thought instead of the way Sebastian Ashford's eyes had lingered on her glove, the way his voice had dropped when he spoke of hiding his own scars behind a cold reputation. A man like that did not send invitations out of simple courtesy. He sent them because he intended to keep looking until he found what he was searching for. Her brother, Edmund, slouched in the doorway with a cup of watered wine he should not have been drinking so early in the day. What does he want with you exactly? He asked, suspicion creeping into his tone despite his own role in causing this entire disaster. Dukes do not invite ruined families to tea without a reason. I do not know, Eleanor admitted, and it was the truth. But I intend to find out. Be careful, Edmund said, some flicker of guilt crossing his face at last. I never meant for this to fall on you. You rarely mean for anything, Eleanor replied, though there was no true anger in it, only the tired affection of a sister who had spent years cleaning up messes she had not made. She left him standing there and climbed the narrow stairs to her room, where she sat by the window and watched the fading light stretch long shadows across the overgrown garden below. She thought of the scar again, as she often did in quiet moments, remembering the way the fire had roared through the east wing 3 years ago, the screams of a servant girl trapped upstairs with her infant daughter, the choice Eleanor had made in an instant without stopping to consider the danger to herself. She remembered the pain, sharp and searing as she had pulled the child free through a window already thick with smoke. She remembered, too, the silence that followed, the way her family had chosen to speak of the fire only as an accident, an unfortunate loss of property, never once acknowledging what she had actually done that night. No one outside her household knew the truth. Certainly no Duke, however sharp his eyes, could have guessed the full shape of it from a single glance at her gloved hand. And yet something in the way he had spoken unsettled her deeply, as though he had already sensed there was courage buried beneath the secrecy, not shame. She fell asleep that night still turning his words over in her mind, wondering what kind of man looked at a frightened, defensive stranger and saw not a liar, but someone worth understanding. The tea service sat untouched between them for nearly 10 minutes, before Sebastian Ashford finally spoke, and when he did, his question caught Eleanor as off guard as the first one had. Tell me about your brother, he said. Not the drunken fool who insulted me, the man he was before that night. Eleanor set down her cup, surprised. She had arrived at Ashbourne Hall braced for questions about her hand again, prepared with a dozen deflections, and instead found herself facing a request she had not anticipated at all. Edmund was not always like this, she said slowly. Our father spoiled him terribly after our mother passed. He believed a son needed indulgence rather than discipline, and Edmund grew into a man who expects the world to forgive him, simply because he apologizes prettily afterward. And does the world forgive him? Usually, Eleanor admitted. Though I suspect your grace does not intend to be so easily won over. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of Sebastian's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she had seen from him since her arrival, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the sight of it. I am not easily won over by anyone, he said, least of all young men who insult me in public and then hide behind their sisters to make amends. He did not hide behind me, Eleanor said, a flash of protectiveness rising despite herself. Our father sent me because he believed a woman's apology would seem more sincere, less likely to provoke your grace's temper. Your father is a coward then, in addition to being in debt. The bluntness of it stung, though Eleanor could not entirely disagree. She had thought the same thing more than once over the past 3 years, watching her father retreat further into denial while their fortunes crumbled around him. You speak very freely for a man who invited me here for tea, she said. I find polite conversation tedious, Sebastian replied. I would rather speak honestly and risk offense than spend an afternoon exchanging empty pleasantries neither of us means. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, taking in the details she had missed during her first visit, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he did not sleep well, the way his hands, when not occupied with his teacup, rested with unusual stillness, as though he had trained himself long ago to appear composed even when he was not. She wondered what had shaped that stillness. What losses had taught a man to guard himself so completely? You mentioned scars of your own, she said, testing the boundary he had opened during their first meeting. The last time we spoke. Something shifted behind his eyes, a brief flicker of surprise that she had dared to press the subject he himself had raised. I did, he said. Will you tell me? Perhaps, if you tell me about your hand first. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her cup. That is not a fair trade, your grace. Nothing about this conversation has been fair, he said, though not unkindly. You arrived here to apologize for a crime you did not commit, and I have spent our 2 meetings pressing you about a wound you clearly wish to keep private. I am not a fair man, Miss Whitmore. I am simply an honest one, when I choose to be. She looked down at her gloved hand resting in her lap, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied thoughts of that night. She had guarded the secret so carefully for so long that the idea of speaking it aloud, even in fragments, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Not today, she said finally. I am not ready. Then we will speak of other things, Sebastian said, and to her surprise, he did not press further. Instead, he asked about her mother, about the estate before her father's debts had consumed it, about the books she read, and the small pleasures that remained to her, despite her family's difficulties. Eleanor found herself answering more openly than she intended, drawn out by his genuine attention in a way she had not experienced with any suitor or acquaintance in years. You are curious about everyone, or only about ruined young women sent to apologize on behalf of their families? She asked eventually, half teasing, half genuinely wondering. Only about people who interest me, Sebastian said, which is a rarer occurrence than you might imagine. And I interest you? You do. The simple honesty of his answer left her momentarily speechless. She was not accustomed to such directness, particularly not from a man of his rank, who could have easily dismissed her with cold formality and never thought of her again. Instead, he sat across from her, asking real questions and offering real answers, treating her not as a problem to be managed but as a person worth understanding. "May I ask about your engagement?" she said, emboldened by his openness. "The one that ended." His expression closed slightly, though he did not refuse to answer. "Her name was Margaret. We were to be married 3 years ago. She left me for another man 2 weeks before the wedding, a man with a larger fortune and, I suspect, a warmer temperament than mine. I am sorry." "Do not be. It taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between affection and convenience." He set down his cup, his gaze distant for a moment. "I built walls after that. Cold reputation, careful distance, the kind of composure that keeps people from asking questions they have no right to ask. And yet you ask me questions constantly, because I recognize the walls you have built are not so different from my own," he said, "and I find I am curious what lies behind them, even though I have spent 3 years refusing to let anyone near mine." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a dangerous warmth she had not expected to feel in the presence of a man she had arrived fearing only days before. She reminded herself sharply that this was still a duke, still a man whose favor her family's survival depended upon, still someone she could not afford to trust too quickly, however honest his words seemed. "Your Grace speaks as though we are alike," she said carefully, "but you are a duke with every advantage, and I am the daughter of a ruined house. Whatever walls we have built, our reasons cannot be the same." "Perhaps not," he conceded. "But loneliness does not care much for rank, Miss Whitmore. I have found that out rather thoroughly these past 3 years." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the afternoon light shifting gold across the room. Eleanor found herself studying his face, searching for the coldness the county so often described, and finding instead something far more complicated, a man who had learned to armor himself against pain, and had perhaps forgotten how to remove that armor even when he wished to. "Walk with me," Sebastian said suddenly, rising and extending a hand toward the tall doors that led to the garden beyond. "I find conversation easier when I am not sitting still. It is a poor habit, but an honest one." Eleanor accepted, letting him lead her out into the cool afternoon air, past neat rows of late roses and a fountain that had long since gone quiet for the season. The gravel path crunched beneath their feet as they walked, and for a while neither spoke, content simply to exist in each other's company, without the pressure of confession or apology. "Your gardens are lovely," she said eventually, if only to break the silence. "Even now, with everything fading toward winter. My mother designed them. Before she died," Sebastian said, "she believed a garden should have something worth seeing in every season, not only in summer when the flowers are easiest to love. I have never had the heart to change it. That is a rare kind of loyalty, or a rare kind of stubbornness. I have been told the two often look the same in me." He glanced sideways at her, something almost playful in his expression, a lightness she had not seen from him before. "You have not asked me anything about myself since we began walking. I find that unusual, given how thoroughly I have interrogated you these past 2 visits." "I did not think it was my place to ask," Eleanor said. "You are a duke. I assumed there were things a woman in my position should not inquire about." "Forget your position for a moment," he said. "Ask me something, anything." She considered for a long moment, turning over dozens of questions in her mind before settling on one that felt both safe and genuinely curious. "Why did you never remarry, after Margaret? 3 years is a long time for a man of your rank to remain unattached." "Because every young woman my mother's friends paraded before me wanted the title, not the man attached to it," he said. "I grew tired of performing charm for women who saw only Ashbourne Hall and the coronet that comes with it. Eventually, I stopped trying altogether, and the county decided I had simply become cold and unfeeling, which was easier for everyone to believe than the truth. And what is the truth? That I was waiting, though I did not admit it even to myself, for someone who might ask me a real question, instead of calculating my worth in acres and income. He stopped walking, and turned to face her fully, his expression unusually open. "You have not asked me a single question about my fortune since you arrived, Miss Whitmore. Not once in either visit." "I had not thought of it," Eleanor admitted, surprised by the observation. "I suppose I have been too preoccupied wondering what you wanted from me to consider what I might want from you. And now that you have considered it? What do you want?" The question hung between them, heavier than the autumn air. Eleanor searched for an answer that felt honest without revealing too much, without exposing the fragile, unfamiliar hope that had begun to take root in her chest since her first visit to Ashbourne Hall. "I want," she said slowly, "to be seen as something other than a burden or an apology or a debt to be settled. I have spent so long being all three that I have nearly forgotten what it feels like to simply be a person someone wishes to know." Sebastian's expression softened into something Eleanor had not yet seen from him, something gentle and unguarded. "Then we want the same thing, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps that is reason enough to keep asking each other questions, even the difficult ones, until we find our way to easier answers." "I should return home," she said eventually, though some part of her was reluctant to leave. "My father will worry." "Of course." Sebastian rose and offered his hand to help her from her chair, a small gesture of courtesy that felt, in that moment, weighted with more meaning than it should have. "Will you come again, Miss Whitmore? Do you require it, as reparation for my brother's insult?" "No," he said. "I am asking because I wish it, not because I require anything at all." Eleanor hesitated at the door, her hand still resting lightly in his. "Then yes," she said, "I will come again." As she settled into the carriage for the ride home, she found her thoughts consumed not by worry over her family's debts or her brother's foolishness, but by the strange, unsettling comfort of a duke who spoke honestly, who noticed everything, and who seemed determined to understand her rather than simply judge her. She did not yet know that within days, the county would begin whispering about her frequent visits to Ashbourne Hall, or that those whispers would soon threaten to undo whatever fragile peace she had managed to build with the one man who had ever truly looked at her and asked the right questions. For now, she allowed herself the small, dangerous pleasure of hoping that perhaps, for the first time in years, someone had seen past her carefully guarded surface and found something worth staying for. That evening, her father questioned her closely about the visit, eager for any sign that the Duke's favor had been secured. Eleanor gave careful, measured answers, omitting the parts that felt too fragile to share, too easily crushed beneath her father's calculating hopes for the family's restored fortune. "He asked you to walk in the gardens?" her father pressed, leaning forward in his chair with a hunger that made Eleanor's stomach turn. "That is promising, Eleanor. Very promising indeed. A duke does not walk alone with a woman, unless he intends something by it." "He intends nothing beyond conversation, father," Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them herself. "Please do not build hopes upon a single afternoon of tea and idle talk." "Idle talk with a duke is never truly idle," her father replied, and there was a calculating gleam in his eye that Eleanor recognized all too well. The same gleam that had led him to gamble away half the estate on schemes that promised quick fortune and delivered only ruin. "If he takes a liking to you, our troubles could be over within the year." "I am not a solution to be deployed, father," Eleanor said sharply, more sharply than she intended. "I am not a wager you can place to recover your losses." Her father's face fell, chastened, though she suspected the guilt would not last long against the weight of his desperation. She left him sitting by the fire and climbed the stairs to her room, closing the door softly behind her, before allowing herself to breathe freely for the first time since returning home. She kept the memory of Sebastian's honesty close instead, turning it over in her mind long after the house had gone quiet, wondering when, if ever, she might find the courage to answer his question about her hand. She thought of the way he had spoken of Margaret, of the walls he admitted to building, of the quiet loneliness beneath his cold reputation. She thought, too, of the strange comfort of walking beside him in the fading garden, saying nothing at all and somehow feeling more understood than she had in years of careful, guarded silence. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor lay awake long past midnight, staring at the ceiling, torn between the fear of what might happen if the Duke ever learned the full truth of her scar, and the equally frightening possibility that she might, despite every instinct toward caution, be beginning to trust him with it. Smoke filled Eleanor's dreams that night, thick and choking, the same way it had filled her lungs 3 years ago when she pressed a wet cloth to her face and ran toward the burning east wing instead of away from it. She woke gasping, her heart pounding against her ribs, her right hand throbbing with a pain that existed only in memory now, the nerves long since healed over into scar tissue that ached sometimes in dreams though never in waking life. She sat up in the darkness of her room and pressed her palm flat against her chest, waiting for her breathing to steady, waiting for the present to reassert itself over the past. By the time she arrived at Ashbourne Hall 3 days later for what had become a regular visit, she had convinced herself she would keep the conversation light, safely distant from scars and fires and the guilt she had carried alone for 3 long years. Sebastian had other plans. "You look tired," he said, the moment she was seated in his study, the fire crackling low against the autumn chill outside. "You did not sleep well. How could you possibly know that? There are shadows beneath your eyes that were not there during our last visit, and you have been rubbing your right hand absently since you sat down, though you likely are not aware of it." He gestured toward her hand, and Eleanor glanced down to find she had indeed been pressing her thumb against her palm, an old habit she thought she had broken years ago. "You notice too much, Your Grace," she said, folding her hands firmly in her lap. "I have little else to occupy my attention," he said, "besides estate business and the occasional insult from young men who cannot hold their drink. Forgive me if I find you considerably more interesting than either." Despite herself, Eleanor felt the corner of her mouth twitch toward a smile. There was something disarming about his bluntness, something that made deflection feel not only difficult but somehow unnecessary, as though the careful walls she had built for years were simply irrelevant in his presence. "I dreamed of fire," she admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. "It happens sometimes, though less often now than it once did." Sebastian went very still, his full attention fixed on her in a way that felt almost physical, a weight settling across the room. "Tell me," he said, gently this time, none of the earlier bluntness in his voice, only quiet invitation. Eleanor looked at the fire, at the flames dancing harmlessly behind the iron grate, and found herself, for the first time in 3 years, wanting to speak the truth aloud, rather than burying it deeper. "There was a fire at our estate," she began slowly, 3 years ago, in early autumn, much like now. "It started in the east wing, in the nursery where one of our servants, a young woman named Charlotte, slept with her infant daughter. No one is entirely certain how it began. A candle left too close to the curtains, perhaps, or a spark from the hearth that caught before anyone noticed." "Go on," Sebastian said softly. "I was awake that night, unable to sleep, and I smelled smoke before anyone raised the alarm. By the time I reached the east wing, the fire had already spread through the corridor outside the nursery, and Charlotte was trapped inside with her daughter, screaming for help that had not yet arrived." Eleanor's voice trembled, the memory rising sharp and vivid despite the years that had passed. "I did not think, I only acted. I wrapped my arm in a wet curtain from the hallway and broke through the door, and I found Charlotte collapsed near the window, overcome by smoke, with the baby still clutched against her chest. And your hand?" "I lifted the baby through the window to a footman standing below, and in doing so, my sleeve caught on a burning beam that had fallen from the ceiling. I did not feel it at first. I did not feel anything until I had gone back for Charlotte and pulled her through the same window, and by then, the damage was already done." Eleanor turned her gloved hand over slowly, staring at it as though she could see straight through the fabric to the scar beneath. "The east wing burned for another hour before the fire was finally contained. We lost nearly a third of the house. Charlotte and her daughter survived, though Charlotte's lungs were never quite the same afterward." Sebastian said nothing for a long moment, his expression unreadable, though his eyes never left her face. "That is not a story of shame, Miss Whitmore," he said finally. "That is a story of extraordinary courage. My family did not see it that way." Eleanor's voice hardened slightly, old bitterness rising to the surface. "My father was furious about the damage to the house, the cost of rebuilding, the disruption to our already fragile finances. He forbade anyone from speaking of what I had actually done that night. As far as the county knows, the fire was simply an accident, a tragic loss of property, nothing more. He was ashamed that his daughter had run toward danger rather than away from it, ashamed that people might whisper about a young woman behaving so recklessly, however noble the cause. He should have been proud." "He was afraid," Eleanor said, "afraid of scandal, afraid of what suitors might think of a woman with a ruined hand and a reckless disposition. He decided it was better for everyone if the truth simply disappeared, buried beneath talk of candles and curtains and unfortunate accidents. so I learned to hide it too. The glove became habit, then necessity, then something I could not imagine removing in public, not even to explain what had truly happened. And Charlotte, the servant girl you saved? She still works for my family, in the kitchens now, since her lungs no longer allow for the physical work she once did upstairs. Her daughter is nearly 4 years old. Neither of them speaks of that night either, out of loyalty to my father, though I know Charlotte has never forgotten what I did. A faint, sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. She calls me her guardian angel, when no one else is listening. It is the only time anyone has ever spoken of that night as something other than a disaster to be forgotten. Sebastian rose from his chair and crossed the room to kneel before her, an act so unexpected, so far removed from the cold, distant reputation the county had built around him, that Eleanor's breath caught entirely. He reached for her gloved hand, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when she did not, he gently worked the glove free, revealing the scarred skin beneath, pale and uneven, stretching from the back of her hand up toward her wrist. "This," he said quietly, tracing the edge of the scar with careful, reverent fingers, "is not something to be ashamed of. This is proof of who you are, Miss Whitmore. Proof that when the moment demanded courage, you did not hesitate." Eleanor felt tears rise unexpectedly, 3 years of carefully guarded shame beginning to crack beneath the weight of his gentle attention. "No one has ever looked at it and seen anything but a flaw," she whispered. "A blemish to be hidden, a reminder of the damage I caused." "Then everyone who looked at it before me was blind," Sebastian said simply. "I see courage. I see a woman who chose to run toward danger when every instinct must have screamed at her to run away. I see someone I admire more with every conversation we share, not less." "You cannot mean that." "I have never meant anything more sincerely in my life." He held her hand a moment longer before releasing it, allowing her the choice of whether to replace the glove or leave her hand bare between them. She left it bare, and something in her chest loosened at the small act of trust. The first time in 3 years she had allowed anyone outside her immediate household to see the scar without flinching or offering excuses. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked, echoing the question she had posed during her first visit, though this time her voice carried genuine curiosity rather than defensive suspicion. "You are a duke. You could have any woman in the county, women without scars, without ruined families, without the burden of debt attached to their names." "I have met those women," Sebastian said, returning to his own chair, though his gaze remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have danced with them, courted a few of them briefly, and found every single one of them utterly forgettable. They performed charm the way an actress performs a role, saying what they believed I wished to hear, hiding whatever truth existed beneath layers of practiced grace. You have done nothing but resist me at every turn, Miss Whitmore, and somehow that resistance has told me more about your character than 100 practiced smiles ever could." "I have not been trying to charm you," Eleanor said, a note of dry humor creeping into her voice despite the weight of the conversation. "I have mostly been trying to survive our conversations without revealing too much. And yet here we are," Sebastian said, with rather a lot revealed. Eleanor laughed softly, surprising herself with the sound, unfamiliar and warm after the heaviness of the story she had just shared. "Here we are," she agreed. They spoke for another hour, the conversation drifting into gentler territory, memories of childhood, favorite books, the small comforts that had sustained each of them through their respective griefs. Eleanor found herself, for the first time since the fire, speaking of that night without the accompanying weight of shame, framing it instead the way Sebastian had framed it, as an act of courage rather than a source of disgrace. "Tell me more of Charlotte," Sebastian said at one point, genuine interest in his voice. "You speak of her as though she matters to you a great deal." "She does," Eleanor said. "We grew up together, in a manner of speaking, though she was always below stairs and I was always above them. Her mother served as a maid to my own mother before she passed, and Charlotte and I used to sneak away from our duties as children to play in the orchard behind the house. She was the closest thing to a sister I ever had, closer even than my own cousins. And after the fire? My father wanted to dismiss her," Eleanor admitted, old anger surfacing in her voice. "He believed the fire had started because of her carelessness, though nothing was ever proven, and I fought him on it more fiercely than I have fought him on anything else in my life. I told him if Charlotte went, I would go with her, and find some way to support us both, however impossible that threat truly was. He relented eventually, though he never forgave either of us fully for the damage to the house. You would have left, truly, if he had dismissed her." "I do not know," Eleanor admitted honestly. I have asked myself that question many times since, and I still cannot say for certain what I would have done. But I meant it in the moment, with every part of myself. Charlotte did nothing wrong that night, and I could not bear the thought of her losing her position, her home, her livelihood, because of a fire that was never her fault to begin with. You are a fiercely loyal woman, Miss Whitmore. I have had to be, Eleanor said quietly. Loyalty is often the only currency available to those of us without fortune or standing to offer instead. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite name, something between admiration and something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken, despite her efforts to remain composed. I find myself increasingly certain, he said finally, that whatever debt your family believes it owes, mine has been repaid 100 times over, simply by allowing me the privilege of these conversations. You flatter me, Your Grace. I do not flatter, he said. I have already told you, I find it tedious. I speak only what I believe to be true. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to such direct admiration, particularly from a man whose reputation had led her to expect coldness rather than warmth. She busied herself with her tea, though it had long since gone cold, if only to give her hands something to do besides tremble. May I ask you something in return? She said eventually, curiosity finally overcoming her earlier restraint. You mentioned scars of your own, when we first met. You have shared pieces of your history with Margaret, but I sense there is more beneath that story than a simple broken engagement. Sebastian's expression grew distant, the openness of moments before retreating slightly behind old, familiar walls. There is more, he admitted. Though I am not certain I am ready to share all of it, even now. I understand, Eleanor said gently. I did not intend to press. No, he said. You have earned the right to ask, at the very least. Perhaps not the full answer, not yet. But I owe you honesty in return for the honesty you have given me today. He paused, gathering his thoughts, his hands resting still and careful in his lap. My father was not a kind man, Miss Whitmore. He ruled this house through fear rather than affection, and he taught me from a young age that emotion was a weakness to be suppressed rather than expressed. When Margaret left me, I told myself it confirmed everything he had taught me, that affection was simply a tool others used to extract what they wanted before abandoning you the moment something better appeared. I built my reputation for coldness quite deliberately after that, believing it would protect me from ever being so thoroughly deceived again. And has it? Protected me, yes, but it has also left me remarkably alone for 3 years, speaking to no one honestly except the occasional business associate and my own reflection in the mirror. A faint, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. Until a ruined young woman arrived at my door to apologize for her brother's foolishness, and somehow managed to dismantle 3 years of careful walls within the span of 2 brief conversations. I have not dismantled anything, Eleanor protested, though the warmth in her chest suggested otherwise. You have dismantled a great deal more than you realize, Sebastian said quietly. I find myself looking forward to your visits with an eagerness I have not felt in years, Miss Whitmore. I find myself thinking of our conversations long after you have gone. I am not entirely certain what to make of that, but I no longer wish to pretend it is not happening. Eleanor's heart pounded at the admission, torn between the instinct toward caution that had protected her for so long, and the equally powerful pull toward a man who had, in the span of a few short visits, seen her more clearly than anyone had in years. When at last she rose to leave, Sebastian walked her to the door himself, dismissing the servant who usually performed the task. Thank you, he said quietly, for trusting me with the truth. Thank you, Eleanor replied, for asking the question no one else was brave enough to ask. As her carriage carried her home through the gathering dusk, Eleanor found herself studying her bare hand where it rested in her lap, glove tucked away in her reticule rather than covering the scar. For the first time in 3 years, she did not immediately reach to hide it. She simply let it rest there, in the fading light, and allowed herself to feel, however briefly, the strange and unfamiliar lightness of being fully seen. She did not yet know that her extended absences from home, her frequent visits to Ashbourne Hall, had already begun to draw attention throughout the county, whispers passing from parlor to parlor, with the particular speed reserved for scandal involving a duke and a ruined family's daughter. She did not yet know that the fragile peace she had found in Sebastian's study would soon be tested by forces far beyond her control. At home, Charlotte met her at the servants' entrance, drawn by the sound of the returning carriage, her young daughter balanced on her hip. You look different tonight, Miss Eleanor, she said, studying Eleanor's face with the particular perceptiveness of someone who had known her since childhood. Lighter, somehow. Do I? Eleanor asked. though she suspected she already knew the answer. You do. Charlotte's eyes drifted to Eleanor's bare hand, uncovered even now, and a small, knowing smile crossed her face. I always told you that hand was nothing to hide, Miss Eleanor. Perhaps you have finally found someone willing to listen. Eleanor said nothing, but she pressed a gentle kiss to the crown of Charlotte's daughter's head before making her way inside, carrying with her the fragile, unfamiliar warmth of a day that had asked more of her than any before it, and left her, against every careful instinct, glad that it had. Lady Pembroke's fan snapped shut with a sound sharp enough to cut through the entire ballroom, and Eleanor felt every eye in the room turn toward her at once. 6 visits in 3 weeks, Lady Pembroke said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of women gathered near the refreshment table. One wonders what business could possibly require a young woman to spend so much time alone with a duke. Eleanor kept her chin level and her expression composed, though her stomach twisted with familiar dread. She had known the whispers would come eventually. She had simply hoped for more time before they did. My family owed His Grace an apology, she said evenly. The matter required more than a single conversation to resolve. 6 visits, Lady Pembroke repeated, arching one thin eyebrow. That is rather a lot of apologizing, Miss Whitmore. Some might say it is not apology at all that keeps you returning to Ashbourne Hall so often. The women around her tittered softly, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks despite her determination to remain unaffected. She had grown accustomed to whispers over the years, ever since her father's debts became public knowledge, but this felt different, sharper, aimed directly at the fragile happiness she had only just begun to allow herself. Believe what you wish, Lady Pembroke, Eleanor said, and turned to walk away before the older woman could press further, though she could still hear the murmurs following her across the ballroom floor. By the time she arrived home that night, her father was waiting in the parlor, his face drawn with an anxiety she recognized all too well, the particular expression he wore whenever he sensed the family's fragile standing under threat. The gossip has reached me already, he said without preamble, before Eleanor had even removed her cloak. Lord Ashworth mentioned it at his club this very afternoon. People are saying you have become the Duke's mistress, Eleanor. Do you understand what that could do to this family's name? I have done nothing improper, Eleanor said, though exhaustion colored her voice more than genuine surprise. She had known this conversation was coming. His Grace and I have had conversations, nothing more. 6 visits is not conversation, it is courtship, or worse, her father snapped, pacing the length of the small parlor with the particular agitation of a man who had spent years watching his family's fortunes decline, and could not bear the thought of one final scandal undoing whatever remained of their standing. If word spreads that you have compromised yourself with him and nothing comes of it, no respectable man in the county will consider you afterward. You will have ruined yourself for nothing. I have not compromised myself, Eleanor said, her patience thinning. I have spoken with him, walked with him in his garden, shared conversation over tea. That is the whole of it, father, however much the gossips wish to imagine otherwise. It does not matter what actually occurred, her father said, some of the fight going out of his voice, replaced instead with weary resignation. It only matters what people believe occurred. You know this as well as I do. We cannot afford another scandal, Eleanor. Not after Edmund's foolishness, not after everything else. Eleanor said nothing, though her chest ached with the unfairness of it, the knowledge that something which had felt, for the first time in years, genuinely good and hopeful, was now being twisted into scandal by people who had never bothered to know her at all. 2 days later, an invitation arrived from Ashbourne Hall, and Eleanor hesitated longer than usual before accepting it, weighing her father's warnings against the pull she felt toward Sebastian's company, toward the quiet honesty of their conversations that felt increasingly like the only genuine thing in her life. In the end she went, though she arrived at Ashbourne Hall with visible tension in her shoulders that Sebastian noticed immediately. Something is troubling you, he said, before she had even taken her seat. Tell me. The county has begun to talk, Eleanor admitted, deciding there was little point in concealing it from a man who had already proven himself capable of reading her far too easily, about my visits here, about what they imagine is occurring between us. Sebastian's expression darkened, though not, she quickly realized, at her. And what precisely are they imagining? That I have become your mistress, Eleanor said plainly, watching for his reaction, or worse, that I am angling to trap you into marriage through calculated ruin of my own reputation. That is absurd, Sebastian said, anger flashing in his eyes for the first time since she had known him. You have done nothing but answer my invitations, at my own persistent request. If anyone bears responsibility for the frequency of your visits, it is myself. not you. The county rarely concerns itself with fairness when assigning blame to a woman, Your Grace, Eleanor said, old bitterness creeping into her voice. My father fears the damage this could do to our family's already fragile standing. He has asked me to end my visits here. And is that what you wish? Eleanor hesitated, torn between the caution that had protected her for years and the unfamiliar, stubborn hope that had taken root during their recent conversations. I do not know what I wish, she admitted honestly. I know that these visits have given me something I did not realize I was missing until I found it. But I also know my family cannot survive another scandal, and I am tired, Your Grace. Tired of my choices always being weighed against my family's fragile reputation rather than my own happiness. Sebastian rose and crossed to the window, his back to her for a long moment, silent contemplation replacing the anger of moments before. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression had settled into something resolved, determined. Then let us end the gossip properly, he said, rather than allowing it to dictate whether you are permitted to visit a friend. How do you propose we do that? There is a ball at Lord Pembroke's estate this coming Friday, Sebastian said. I intend to attend, and I intend to make my regard for you plain before the entire county, so thoroughly that no one dares whisper otherwise afterward. Eleanor's heart pounded at the suggestion, equal parts thrilled and terrified by the boldness of it. That could make things considerably worse, if your intentions are misread, or if the county decides to view it as confirmation of the very rumors we wish to silence. Then let them view it as confirmation, Sebastian said, because I find, upon reflection, that I do not mind the rumors nearly so much as I mind the thought of you being made to feel ashamed for accepting invitations I insisted upon extending. The ball arrived 3 days later, and Eleanor entered Lord Pembroke's grand hall with her stomach in knots, acutely aware of every gaze that followed her progress across the room. She had barely completed her curtsy to her hosts before Sebastian appeared at her side, offering his arm with a formality that drew immediate attention from every corner of the ballroom. Miss Whitmore, he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. I have been anticipating this dance all week. Whispers erupted immediately around them, though Eleanor found, to her surprise, that she cared considerably less about them with Sebastian's steady presence beside her. He led her onto the dance floor, and for the length of the dance, the rest of the ballroom seemed to fade into irrelevant background noise, replaced entirely by the warmth of his hand against hers and the quiet intensity of his attention. You are drawing a great deal of attention, Your Grace, she murmured, as they moved through the steps. Good, he said. I intend to draw a great deal more before this evening concludes. True to his word, when the dance ended, Sebastian did not simply return her to the edge of the room as propriety might have suggested. Instead, he kept her hand in his and addressed Lady Pembroke directly, his voice carrying clearly across the surrounding guests. Lady Pembroke, he said, I understand there has been some speculation regarding Miss Whitmore's recent visits to Ashbourne Hall. Allow me to clarify the matter plainly, so that no further speculation need trouble anyone's imagination. I have sought Miss Whitmore's company because I find her conversation, her character, and her courage more compelling than any other woman I have encountered in years. If that constitutes scandal in the eyes of this county, then I fear the county's standards require considerable reconsideration. A stunned silence fell over the nearby guests, Lady Pembroke's fan frozen mid-motion, her mouth slightly open with the particular shock of someone whose gossip had just been publicly and thoroughly dismantled. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, though this time with something closer to pride than shame, standing beside a man who had chosen, deliberately and publicly, to defend her rather than let her reputation be quietly sacrificed to preserve his own. You did not need to do that, she said quietly, once they had moved away from the stunned crowd, finding a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the darkened gardens. I wanted to, Sebastian said simply. I am tired of hiding behind cold reputation and careful distance, Miss Whitmore. I find that I would rather be known, fully, even if that means enduring the county's speculation, than continue pretending indifference to something that has become, rather unexpectedly, the most important part of my week. Eleanor looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and finding none. The most important part of your week, she repeated softly. The most important part of my life, if I am honest, he said, though I recognize it may be too soon to say such things plainly. Perhaps, Eleanor said, though she found herself smiling despite the lingering weight of the evening's tension. But I find I do not mind honesty, however soon it arrives. Across the ballroom, Edmund Whitmore watched the exchange with an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to something darker, something calculating. He had arrived that evening hoping only to salvage what remained of his own reputation after weeks of pointed silence from former friends, and instead found himself watching his sister receive the very public attention he had once assumed would never belong to their diminished family. He said nothing to Eleanor that night, but he watched Sebastian's public declaration with a curious, unsettled intensity that Eleanor, absorbed in her own relief, did not notice at all. Her father, however, found her before the evening concluded, his expression a peculiar mixture of astonishment and renewed calculation. "The Duke spoke of you before the entire assembly," he said, drawing her aside near the refreshment tables, his voice hushed with something between disbelief and hunger. "Eleanor, do you understand what this means? If his regard is genuine, if it leads where such declarations typically lead, our troubles could be entirely resolved." "Father," Eleanor said wearily, "please do not reduce this to a solution for your debts. Whatever exists between His Grace and myself, I would ask that you allow it to exist without calculating its value to this family's finances." "I only wish to see you settled," her father said, though the eagerness in his eyes told a somewhat different story, one Eleanor had grown tired of confronting over the years. "A duke's regard is not something to take lightly, Eleanor. Do not let foolish pride cost this family its last chance at restored fortune." Eleanor turned away from him without answering, weary of a conversation she had endured in various forms throughout her entire adult life, her father's concerns always circling back, inevitably, to money rather than her own well-being. She found Sebastian waiting near the terrace doors, and the tension in her shoulders eased somewhat at the sight of him, a small, steady comfort amid the swirling attention of the evening. "Your father looked rather pleased," Sebastian observed, offering his arm as they stepped out onto the terrace for a moment of relative privacy. "He is already calculating how my happiness might resolve his debts," Eleanor admitted, a familiar weariness in her voice. "I apologize if that seems ungracious. I do love him, despite everything, but I have grown tired of being viewed as a solution to problems rather than a person in my own right." "You need not apologize to me," Sebastian said. "I understand better than most what it is to be viewed as a solution rather than a person. My own title has attracted considerably more suitors than my character ever has." He paused, studying her carefully in the moonlight spilling across the terrace. "I did not speak as I did tonight to satisfy your father's calculations, Miss Whitmore. I spoke because I meant every word, and because I grew weary of watching you carry the weight of gossip you did not deserve." "I know," Eleanor said softly, "and I am grateful, more than I can properly express." They remained by the window for a long while, speaking quietly while the ball continued around them, the whispers gradually shifting from scandal to something closer to grudging fascination. Eleanor did not know, as she finally departed for home that evening, that her brother's own desperation to escape the county's judgment would soon threaten to unravel everything she and Sebastian had built, twisting the truth of her scar into a weapon aimed squarely at the reputation Sebastian had just defended so publicly. For that night at least, she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in years, the quiet, steady confidence of being chosen, openly and without apology, by someone who saw her entirely and found her worth defending. The letter arrived at Ashbourne Hall 3 days after the ball, and by the time Sebastian finished reading it, his hands were trembling with a fury Eleanor had never witnessed from him before. He summoned her that same afternoon, and when she arrived, she found him pacing his study with the letter clutched in one fist, his expression thunderous in a way that immediately set her heart racing with dread. "What has happened?" she asked, closing the door behind her, alarmed by the sight of him so thoroughly undone from his usual composure. "Your brother," Sebastian said, holding out the letter, "has apparently decided that his own reputation requires salvaging at the cost of yours." Eleanor took the letter with shaking hands and read quickly, her stomach dropping with each line. It was addressed to Lord Pembroke, though clearly intended to circulate through the county's gossip network with deliberate speed. In it, Edmund had woven a version of the fire 3 years ago that painted his sister not as a rescuer but as reckless and unstable, a young woman whose impulsive, dangerous behavior had nearly cost a servant and her infant daughter their lives, and who had spent 3 years hiding the shameful truth behind a glove and careful silence. "He claims I endangered Charlotte and her child through carelessness," Eleanor said, her voice barely steady, "that I acted rashly without thought for the consequences, that the scar on my hand is proof of instability rather than courage." She looked up at Sebastian, tears of anger and betrayal gathering despite her effort to remain composed. Why would he do this? Why would he twist the truth so completely? "I suspect," Sebastian said grimly, "that your brother has grown tired of being the county's primary source of scandal, and has decided it would serve him better if attention shifted toward you instead. If society believes you reckless and dangerous rather than courageous, it deflects considerably from his own drunken foolishness that started this entire affair. He would sacrifice my reputation to save his own? Eleanor's voice cracked with disbelief, though even as she asked the question, she recognized the pattern all too well. The same selfishness that had defined Edmund since their mother's death, the same willingness to let others bear the consequences of his choices. It appears so, Sebastian said, his anger visibly restrained now, replaced by something colder and more determined. The letter has already begun circulating, I am afraid. Lord Pembroke's household is not known for discretion, and I suspect half the county will have heard some version of this story by tomorrow evening. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, the letter still clutched in her hands. 3 years of carefully guarded shame suddenly threatening to be twisted into something far worse than she had ever feared. She had worried, always, that revealing the truth might expose her to pity or discomfort. She had never imagined it might be weaponized so deliberately, so cruelly, by her own brother. "What am I to do?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar to her. "You are to do nothing," Sebastian said firmly, "because I intend to handle this myself. Sebastian, please, do not make this worse. If you intervene publicly again, the county will only assume further scandal, and my father—" "Your father," Sebastian interrupted, "has spent your entire life allowing others to write the story of your character, first through shame over a fire that should have earned you praise, and now through his own son's cowardice. I do not intend to stand by while that continues, Miss Whitmore, particularly not when I know the truth well enough to correct it myself." Eleanor wanted to argue further, wanted to insist that he was placing himself at unnecessary risk on her behalf, but something in his expression, resolute and immovable, told her the argument would be futile. She had seen that same determination the night of the ball, and she recognized now that Sebastian Ashford, once he had decided upon a course of action, was not a man easily dissuaded. Before that gathering, however, Eleanor returned home to find her father already aware of Edmund's letter, summoned by an anxious note from a neighbor who had heard the rumors spreading and thought it prudent to warn the family directly. She found her father in the parlor, the letter's contents apparently already relayed to him in vivid detail, his face pale with a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like shame. "Is it true?" he asked the moment she entered the room. "Did Edmund truly write such things about you?" "It is true," Eleanor said, too exhausted by the day's events to soften the answer. "He has told the county I acted recklessly, that my scar is proof of instability rather than the truth of what actually happened that night." Her father sank into his chair, running a hand over his face in a gesture of weary defeat she had rarely seen from him. "I did not think even Edmund capable of something so calculated," he said quietly. "Whatever his faults, I believed some loyalty to this family remained in him." "You forbade anyone from speaking the truth of that night in the first place," Eleanor said, old anger finally surfacing after years of careful restraint. "You taught this entire household that my courage was something shameful to be hidden, something to bury beneath talk of unfortunate accidents. Is it truly so surprising that Edmund learned the same lesson and simply applied it more cruelly than you ever intended?" Her father flinched at the accusation, though he did not immediately deny it. "I only wish to protect this family's name," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual bluster. "I see now that in doing so, I may have failed to protect you instead." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "You did." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of 3 years of unspoken resentment finally given voice between them. "What will you do?" her father asked eventually. "His Grace intends to correct the record himself, at Lord Pembroke's gathering in 2 days' time," Eleanor said. "I intend to attend, and to hold my head high regardless of what is said, because I am done, father, being ashamed of something that was never shameful to begin with." Her father nodded slowly, something shifting behind his tired eyes, an acknowledgement she had waited 3 long years to see. "I am proud of you, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I should have said so 3 years ago. I am saying it now, however late it comes." The words, though overdue, settled something unexpectedly tender in Eleanor's chest, and she found herself, despite everything, reaching across the space between their chairs to press her father's hand briefly, before rising to prepare for the difficult days ahead. 2 days later, Lord Pembroke hosted another gathering, smaller than the ball but no less thoroughly attended by the county's most influential families. Drawn by curiosity over the rumors that had spread rapidly since Edmund's letter began circulating, Eleanor arrived reluctantly, urged by Sebastian's insistence that her absence would only fuel further speculation, and found the atmosphere considerably colder than it had been at the ball, whispered conversations halting abruptly whenever she passed, expressions ranging from open curiosity to poorly disguised judgment. Edmund was present as well, though he kept a careful distance from his sister throughout the evening, avoiding her gaze with the particular guilt of a man who knew precisely what he had done and lacked the courage to face the consequences directly. Sebastian arrived later than usual, and when he finally entered Lord Pembroke's drawing room, he did not seek out Eleanor first, as he had at the ball. Instead, he moved directly toward the center of the gathered guests, his expression composed but carrying an unmistakable authority that drew immediate attention. "I understand," he said, his voice pitched to carry clearly across the room, "that a rather distorted account of events from 3 years ago has been circulating throughout this county in recent days. I would like to correct the record, as I believe I am uniquely positioned to do so, having heard the true account directly from those involved." A hush fell over the room, guests exchanging glances, several edging closer to hear more clearly. Eleanor's heart pounded as she watched him, torn between gratitude and fear over what this public reckoning might cost him. 3 years ago, Sebastian continued, a fire broke out in the east wing of the Whitmore estate, threatening the lives of a servant, Charlotte Miller, and her infant daughter. While others hesitated, uncertain of the danger or unwilling to risk themselves, Miss Eleanor Whitmore ran directly toward the flames, wrapped her arm to shield herself as best she could, and broke through a locked door to reach the trapped mother and child. She lifted the infant to safety through a window even as fire consumed the beam above her, sustaining a severe burn to her hand in the process, and returned moments later to pull Charlotte herself to safety before the fire could claim either of their lives. Whispers rippled through the room, several guests turning to look at Eleanor with expressions shifting rapidly from judgment toward something closer to astonishment. "For 3 years," Sebastian continued, his voice hardening slightly, "Miss Whitmore has carried the physical reminder of that night in silence, not out of shame for what she did, but because her own family chose to bury the truth beneath fear of scandal, preferring the county believe the fire a simple accident rather than acknowledge the courage their daughter displayed. I find it a rather remarkable injustice that the very family who benefited from her silence has now allowed a distorted version of that same courage to be weaponized against her, apparently in an effort to distract from entirely unrelated foolishness." His gaze shifted, deliberately, toward Edmund, who stood frozen near the far wall, color draining rapidly from his face as the full weight of the assembled attention turned toward him. "I would ask," Sebastian said, addressing the room once more, "that anyone who has heard the recent distorted account of these events consider carefully the source of that account and weigh it against the testimony of Charlotte Miller herself, who remains in the Whitmore household to this day, and would, I suspect, confirm every word I have just spoken, should anyone care to ask her directly." The silence that followed was profound, broken finally by Lady Pembroke herself, of all people, who set down her teacup with a decisive clink and addressed the room with unexpected firmness. "I, for one, find His Grace's account considerably more credible than idle gossip circulated through unsigned letters," she said. "Miss Whitmore, I believe I owe you an apology for entertaining such talk without proper consideration of its source." Eleanor, stunned by the unexpected shift in the room's sentiment, could barely find her voice. "Thank you, Lady Pembroke," she managed finally, gratitude and lingering shock warring within her chest. Edmund, unable to bear the weight of the assembled scrutiny any longer, made a hurried excuse and departed the gathering entirely, his reputation, already fragile, considerably more damaged than before he had attempted his desperate scheme. Eleanor watched him go with a complicated mixture of anger and pity, knowing that whatever affection remained between them had been fundamentally altered by his willingness to sacrifice her for his own convenience. Sebastian found her a short while later, once the immediate attention of the room had shifted elsewhere, drawn instead into speculation about the dramatic reversal they had all just witnessed. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, concern evident in every line of his face. "I do not entirely know," Eleanor admitted. "I am grateful, more than I can say, for what you did tonight, but I am also grieving, in a strange way, for whatever relationship I believed I still had with my brother. I did not think him capable of something quite this deliberate. People are often more capable of cruelty than we wish to believe, particularly when desperation clouds their judgment," Sebastian said gently. "But you are not responsible for his choices, Eleanor, only your own. And your choices, tonight and 3 years ago, have been nothing but courageous." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the intimacy of it settled warmly in her chest, despite the turmoil of the evening. "You did not need to defend me so publicly," she said. "You have already risked considerable scandal on my behalf, twice now." "I would risk it 100 times more," Sebastian said, "if it meant the truth of who you are might finally be seen clearly, rather than buried beneath other people's fear and convenience." Eleanor looked up at him, the weight of the evening's revelations settling into something quieter, steadier, a recognition that had been building slowly since her very first, reluctant visit to Ashbourne Hall. "I do not know how to properly thank you," she said softly. "You need not thank me at all," Sebastian said. "I have only spoken the truth, Eleanor. The gratitude, if any is owed, belongs to you, for having the courage to share that truth with me in the first place, even when every instinct must have told you to keep hiding." They stood together near the edge of the drawing room for a long while, the gathering continuing around them, transformed now from a scene of judgment into something closer to quiet admiration. Eleanor did not yet know how the days ahead would unfold, whether her father's reaction to Edmund's scheme would bring the family further ruin or some measure of reckoning long overdue. But she knew, standing beside Sebastian in the aftermath of his public defense, that whatever came next, she would not face it hidden behind a glove or buried beneath someone else's shame ever again. That night, riding home in her carriage with her bare hand resting openly in her lap, Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to weep. Not from grief alone, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being fully known, scar and all, by someone who had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to see her exactly as she was. When she arrived home, she found Charlotte waiting near the entrance, having heard already, through the swift channels that carried news between servants' quarters across the county, some version of what had transpired at Lord Pembroke's gathering. "They are saying His Grace spoke of me by name," Charlotte said, wonder evident in her voice. "That he told the whole room what you did for me and my daughter that night." "He did," Eleanor confirmed, managing a tired but genuine smile. "I hope you do not mind that your name was mentioned so publicly." "Mind?" Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for Eleanor's bare hand, pressing it gently between both of her own. "Miss Eleanor, I have waited 3 years for someone to finally speak the truth of that night aloud. I only wish it had not taken a duke's intervention to make the county listen." "So do I," Eleanor admitted, "but I am grateful nonetheless that it happened at all." Edmund did not return home that night, sending word instead, through a servant, that he intended to stay with a friend in a neighboring town until the worst of the county's judgment had subsided. Eleanor felt no great urge to seek him out or demand further explanation. Whatever remained of their sibling bond had been fundamentally altered by his willingness to sacrifice her reputation for his own convenience, and she suspected it would take considerably longer than a few days for that fracture to even begin healing, if it ever fully did. Her father, however, sought her out once more before she retired for the evening, his expression carrying a weight of resolve she had not seen from him in years. "I have decided," he said, "that when Edmund returns, he will need to earn his place in this household again, rather than simply assume it as his birthright. I have been too lenient with him for too long, and I see now the cost of that leniency has fallen far too heavily upon you." "Thank you, Father," Eleanor said, and meant it, recognizing in his words the first genuine shift she had witnessed in him since her mother's death years before. She climbed the stairs to her room that night, exhausted but strangely lighter than she had felt in years, the weight of 3 years of hidden shame finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. She removed her glove, as had become her habit since her conversations with Sebastian began, and studied the scar along her hand in the candlelight, no longer seeing a mark of disgrace, but instead, for the first time, exactly what it had always truly been, proof of a night when she had chosen courage over safety, and had never, not for a single moment, regretted the choice. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of her family's estate, trunk packed and waiting beside her, and told herself the ache in her chest was simply the natural sadness of leaving a place she had once called home, nothing more complicated than that. 3 weeks had passed since the gathering at Lord Pembroke's estate, 3 weeks of gradually restored reputation and cautious peace within her household, and Eleanor had begun to believe, foolishly perhaps, that her visits to Ashbourne Hall might continue indefinitely without further complication. Then her aunt in the north had written, offering a permanent home to any of the family willing to relocate away from the county's still simmering gossip, and her father, still anxious despite the recent improvement in their circumstances, had decided it was the wisest course for Eleanor to accept. "It is only sensible," he had said the previous evening, avoiding her eyes as he spoke. "Distance from the gossip, a fresh start where no one knows the particulars of the fire or your brother's foolishness. Your aunt has connections. respectable suitors who know nothing of our family's recent troubles. Eleanor had wanted to argue, had wanted to insist that she had no wish to start fresh anywhere that did not include Sebastian, but exhaustion and old habits of deference had kept her silent, and now she stood in the entrance hall, waiting for the carriage that would carry her north, away from Ashbourne Hall and everything she had begun, cautiously, to hope for. She had sent word to Sebastian only that morning, a brief note explaining her father's decision, unable to find the words to properly convey everything she felt about leaving him, about the strange, unexpected gift his honesty had given her these past weeks. She had not expected a response before her departure. She certainly had not expected him to arrive in person, breathless and windswept, striding through her family's front door before the footman had even finished announcing him. "You cannot leave," Sebastian said, without preamble, his composure entirely abandoned in a way Eleanor had never witnessed from him before. "Sebastian, I received your note an hour ago," he continued, closing the distance between them with quick, purposeful steps. "I have been writing since, trying to determine what I might possibly say to convince you to stay, and I confess I have arrived without any eloquent speech prepared, only the certainty that I cannot allow you to leave without telling you plainly what I should have said weeks ago." Eleanor's heart pounded, hope and uncertainty warring within her chest, as she studied his face, flushed from writing hard, his usual careful composure entirely stripped away. "Tell me then," she said softly. "When we first met," Sebastian said, "I asked about the scar on your hand, because I noticed you hiding it, and something in that instinct to conceal recognized itself in me. I have spent 3 years hiding my own wounds behind cold reputation, behind careful distance, behind a composure I built specifically to ensure no one could ever again see enough of me to cause real damage." He paused, gathering himself, though his eyes never left hers. "I did not expect, when I asked that first question, that answering it would eventually mean tearing down every wall I had spent 3 years constructing. But that is precisely what has happened, Eleanor. You have seen more of me these past weeks than anyone since my mother died, and rather than fleeing from that vulnerability, I find myself desperate to protect it, to protect us, from a distance that would undo everything we have built. My father believes distance would protect us both from further scandal," Eleanor said, though her voice trembled with the effort of maintaining composure against the rising hope in her chest. "Your father," Sebastian said, "has spent years choosing caution over your happiness, choosing reputation over truth. I understand his fears, Eleanor, I do. But I am not asking you to risk further scandal. I am asking you to consider a future where scandal becomes entirely irrelevant, because your place beside me would be so thoroughly, publicly secured that no gossip could ever again threaten it." Eleanor's breath caught, understanding beginning to dawn even before he continued. "I love you," Sebastian said simply, the words landing with a quiet, devastating honesty that left no room for doubt. "Not despite the scar you hid for 3 years, and not because of some romantic notion of rescuing you from your family's difficulties. I love you because you ran toward danger when every instinct must have screamed at you to run away, because you protected Charlotte's position even when it cost you your father's approval, because you have met every wall I built with honesty rather than retreat, until there was simply nothing left standing between us but the truth of what we feel for each other. I am asking you to marry me, Eleanor Whitmore, not as reparation for your brother's foolishness, not as a solution to your family's debts, but because I cannot imagine facing the rest of my life without your particular courage beside me." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, 3 years of carefully guarded shame and uncertainty, finally dissolving entirely beneath the weight of his declaration. "You are certain?" she asked, needing to hear it once more, needing to be entirely certain this was not simply the impulse of a man caught up in the drama of a dramatic ride and an urgent departure. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Sebastian said. "I love the way you speak honestly, even when honesty costs you comfort. I love that you fought for Charlotte's place in your household even when it meant defying your father. I love the scar on your hand, not as something to be overlooked or forgiven, but as proof of exactly the kind of woman I wish to spend my life beside. Marry me, Eleanor. Stay, and let us build something together that no gossip, no distance, no fear of scandal could ever threaten again." Eleanor closed the remaining distance between them, her bare hand, ungloved as it had been for weeks now, reaching to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both entirely new and somehow inevitable, as though she had been building toward this exact moment, since the first afternoon he had asked about her hidden hand. "I have loved you, I think, since you knelt before me and called my scar proof of courage rather than shame. though I was too frightened to admit it even to myself. Then say yes, Sebastian said, hope and urgency mingling in his voice. Say you will stay, and marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were right to trust me with the truth. Yes, Eleanor said, laughing through her tears, the word carrying 3 years of accumulated hope finally released. Yes, Sebastian, I will stay. I will marry you. Her father, drawn by the commotion in the entrance hall, appeared in the doorway just in time to witness Sebastian pulling Eleanor into an embrace, both of them laughing and crying in equal measure, the trunk still sitting forgotten near the door. He stood silently for a moment, taking in the scene, before a slow, genuine smile spread across his weathered face. I take it, he said, that plans for the North have changed. Entirely, Sebastian said, releasing Eleanor just enough to address her father properly, though he kept her hand firmly clasped in his own. With your permission, sir, I intend to marry your daughter, and I intend to do so as publicly and thoroughly as possible, so that no remaining doubt about her character or my devotion might linger in this county ever again. Eleanor's father looked between them for a long moment, something complicated moving across his features, equal parts relief and genuine happiness finally free of calculation. You have my permission, he said, and my blessing, though I suspect you would have proceeded regardless of my answer, given the state I found you both in upon entering this hall. Sebastian laughed, a rare, unguarded sound that Eleanor had heard only once or twice before, and found herself treasuring completely. Probably so, he admitted, though I am grateful for your blessing nonetheless. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Sebastian quietly settled the remaining debts still weighing on the Whitmore estate, though he insisted, when Eleanor discovered the arrangement and confronted him about it, that he had done so not as payment for her hand, but simply because he could not bear to see her father continue struggling under a weight that no longer needed to exist within their joined family. You did not need to do this, Eleanor said, finding him in his study one afternoon, papers from the estate's solicitor still spread across his desk. I did not agree to marry you so that my family's debts might vanish. I know that, Sebastian said, setting down his pen and meeting her gaze steadily. I did not offer this as a condition of our marriage, Eleanor. I offered it because your father is soon to be my father as well, in a manner of speaking, and I have no wish to begin our life together with old debts still hanging over people I intend to consider family. He will grow too comfortable, Eleanor warned, though her tone carried more affection than true concern. He has never handled comfort particularly well. Then we shall watch him carefully, Sebastian said, and remind him, when necessary, that comfort is a privilege rather than a guarantee. But I would rather extend that grace and risk his complacency than allow pride to keep this family drowning in a debt neither of us truly needs him to carry any longer. Eleanor crossed the room and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek, gratitude and affection intermingling in a way that had become increasingly familiar these past weeks. You are a remarkably good man, Sebastian Ashford, she said, however thoroughly the county once believed otherwise. Only with you, he said. You seem to bring it out in me, this goodness the county never suspected existed. Charlotte, too, found her circumstances quietly improved in the weeks before the wedding, Sebastian arranging for her and her daughter to relocate to Ashbourne Hall itself, offering Charlotte a position better suited to her weakened lungs, overseeing the household linens rather than the more physically demanding kitchen work she had performed for years. When Eleanor thanked him for the arrangement, he simply shrugged, as though the decision had required no particular thought at all. She saved your family a great deal of grief by remaining loyal through difficult years, and you saved her life at considerable cost to yourself, he said. It seemed only right that her circumstances improve alongside yours, particularly given that she will soon be living under my roof as well, in whatever capacity she chooses. Eleanor found herself in quiet moments during those weeks, marveling at how thoroughly her life had transformed since that first, dreaded apology visit to Ashbourne Hall. She had arrived that day expecting humiliation, bracing herself for cold dismissal, or worse, and had instead found a man willing to look past her family's disgrace and her own carefully guarded shame to see something worth pursuing, worth protecting, worth loving without condition or calculation. They were married 6 weeks later, in a ceremony considerably grander than Eleanor had ever imagined for herself, attended by nearly the entire county, including a notably chastened Lady Pembroke, who offered her congratulations with unusual sincerity. Charlotte stood among the guests as well, her daughter perched on her hip, tears of genuine joy streaming down her face as she watched the woman who had saved her life step into a future finally free of hidden shame. Edmund did not attend, having remained largely absent from the family since his scheme unraveled so publicly, though he sent a brief, awkward letter of congratulations that Eleanor read once and set aside without particular emotion, uncertain whether their relationship would ever fully mend, and increasingly at peace with whatever the future held regardless. On her wedding day, Eleanor wore no glove. She stood before the assembled guests with her scarred hand resting openly in Sebastian's. The mark that had once represented 3 years of hidden shame now displayed proudly for the entire county to see, a visible testament to the courage that had brought her, through fire and gossip and fear, to this exact moment. "Do you, Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ashbourne, take this woman?" the officiant began, and Eleanor felt Sebastian's grip tighten gently around her hand, a silent promise that needed no further words to convey its meaning. Later that evening, as the celebrations continued around them, Sebastian drew her aside to the same garden where they had first walked together weeks before, the roses now replaced by the first hints of winter frost, though the space felt no less beautiful for the change of season. "Do you remember," he said, "the first question I ever asked you?" "Why I hid my hand," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory, so distant now despite the relatively short span of time that had passed. "I thought you the most infuriating man I had ever met." "And now?" "Now," Eleanor said, lifting their joined hands to press a gentle kiss against his knuckles. "I think you the only man who ever bothered to ask the right question, and then waited, patiently, for me to find the courage to answer it honestly." "I intend to keep asking the right questions," Sebastian said softly, "for the rest of our lives together, however long that may be." "And I intend to keep answering honestly," Eleanor replied, "scar and all, for exactly as long as you will have me." They stood together in the frost-touched garden as the sounds of celebration drifted from the hall behind them, two people who had each spent years hiding their deepest wounds behind careful walls, finally free of the need for concealment, finally certain that whatever came next, they would face it together, seen fully and loved completely, exactly as they were. Inside the hall, Charlotte watched through the tall windows as the new Duke and Duchess lingered together in the moonlit garden, her daughter asleep against her shoulder, a quiet, private smile touching her lips. She thought of the fire, of the terror of that night, of the small, fierce young woman who had run toward danger without hesitation to save her and her child. She thought too of the years since, watching Eleanor hide behind gloves in careful silence, carrying a burden that had never truly belonged to her alone. "She looks happy," said Eleanor's father, appearing beside Charlotte at the window, his own expression softer than she had seen it in years. "Happier than I have seen her since her mother passed, I think." "She is happy," Charlotte agreed. "She has earned it, more than most." "She has," her father said quietly, guilt still evident beneath the warmth of the evening. "I failed her for a long time, Charlotte. I see that clearly now, though I wish I had seen it sooner, before 3 years of unnecessary shame had already taken root." "It is not too late to do better," Charlotte said gently. "She has forgiven you, I think, or is well on her way toward it. That is more grace than many would offer, given the circumstances." Her father nodded, watching through the glass as Sebastian drew Eleanor closer, the two of them sharing some quiet joke that made her laugh, bright and unguarded, in a way that filled the older man's chest with a relief he had not expected to feel so completely. Whatever mistakes he had made, whatever fear had driven him to bury his daughter's courage beneath talk of accidents and scandal, he could see now, watching her in the garden, that she had found her way to happiness regardless, not because of his choices but in spite of them. Later, when the last of the guests had departed and the hall had grown quiet, Eleanor and Sebastian climbed the wide staircase together, her hand resting easily in his, no glove between them, no hesitation in the way she let her scar rest openly against his palm. "Are you frightened?" Sebastian asked softly, as they reached the top of the stairs, sensing perhaps some final flicker of uncertainty beneath her contentment. "Of this new life, this new title, everything that comes with becoming a duchess?" "A little," Eleanor admitted honestly. "But less frightened than I have been of anything in years, because whatever comes, I know I will not face it hidden or alone." "Never alone," Sebastian confirmed, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against the scarred skin he had once asked about with such disarming directness, the question that had changed the entire course of both their lives. "Never hidden, not with me." Eleanor smiled, the warmth of that promise settling deep and certain within her chest, and together they continued down the quiet hallway, leaving behind, finally and completely, every trace of the shame she had carried for so long, stepping instead into a future built on nothing but honest, hard-won love. A year into her marriage, Eleanor stood once again in the garden of Ashbourne Hall. though this time she was not the nervous young woman who had once been dragged here to apologize for her brother's foolishness, but the confident, settled duchess of a household that had grown, in 12 short months, into something far warmer than the cold, quiet estate it had been before her arrival. Winter had given way to spring, and the roses Sebastian's mother had planted decades before bloomed thick and fragrant along the garden paths, tended now with particular care by Eleanor herself, who had taken to gardening with an enthusiasm that surprised even her husband. She knelt among the flower beds, her scarred hand bare as always, working the soil with the same fearless determination that had once carried her through fire. "You will ruin your gloves," Sebastian said, approaching from the terrace with an easy smile, watching her work with obvious affection. "I am not wearing any," Eleanor said, holding up her bare hand in demonstration, dirt smudged across her palm. "I find I have little use for them these days, except when the weather truly demands it." Sebastian settled onto the stone bench nearby, watching her continue her work for a while in comfortable silence. Their first year of marriage had brought its share of challenges, adjusting to new roles, new responsibilities, the occasional lingering whisper from those in the county who still found it difficult to fully abandon old gossip. But it had brought considerably more joy than difficulty, and Eleanor found herself, in quiet moments like this one, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that first fearful visit to apologize on her family's behalf. Edmund had written twice more since the wedding, brief, stilted letters that suggested some slow, uncertain effort toward reconciliation, though Eleanor remained cautious about extending full trust again so soon. Her father, meanwhile, had visited Ashbourne Hall regularly throughout the year, his relationship with Eleanor gradually healing into something steadier and more honest than it had been during her childhood. The debts Sebastian had settled allowing him, finally, to relax into a life no longer defined by desperate calculation. "Charlotte tells me her daughter has taken quite a liking to the stables," Sebastian said, breaking the comfortable silence. "She spends every free moment there, apparently, following the grooms about and asking endless questions. She reminds me of myself at that age," Eleanor said, smiling as she thought of the little girl she had once pulled from a burning window, now growing into a curious, fearless child, with no memory at all of the dangers she had survived as an infant. "Charlotte worries she will grow too bold for her own good." "Boldness has served the women in this household rather well so far," Sebastian observed, and Eleanor laughed, rising from her work in the garden to join him on the bench, brushing dirt from her hands before settling beside him. "I have been thinking," she said, "about hosting a gathering here, at Ashbourne Hall, for the local families. Nothing so grand as our wedding, simply an afternoon where the county might see this house filled with warmth rather than the cold reputation it once carried." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Sebastian said, "though I suspect much of that transformation has already occurred, simply by virtue of your presence here." "Flatterer," Eleanor said, though she leaned into his shoulder regardless, accepting the compliment with the ease that had grown between them over the past year. They sat together in the garden for a long while, discussing plans for the gathering, for the small improvements Eleanor wished to make to the estate's tenant cottages, for the modest school she hoped to establish in the village for children whose families could not otherwise afford proper education. Sebastian listened to each idea with genuine interest, offering suggestions where useful and support where needed, and Eleanor found herself, as she often did these days, deeply grateful for a partnership built on equal measures of honesty and respect. A week later, the gathering Eleanor had proposed took place beneath a clear spring sky, tables set across the wide lawn behind Ashbourne Hall, laughter and conversation drifting freely among guests who, a year before, might have crossed the street rather than acknowledge the Whitmore name too openly. Lady Pembroke attended with her usual entourage, considerably humbled since her public error in judgment the previous autumn, and made a particular point of complimenting Eleanor's roses, a small gesture that Eleanor accepted graciously, recognizing it for the peace offering it was. Charlotte's daughter ran barefoot across the grass with several other children from the village, shrieking with delighted laughter as they chased each other between the tables, entirely unaware of the danger she had survived as an infant, or the courage that had shaped so much of the household she now called home. Eleanor watched her for a while, a quiet, contented smile touching her lips, before Sebastian appeared at her side, offering a glass of lemonade and a warm hand at her back. "You seem pleased," he observed, following her gaze toward the laughing children. "I am," Eleanor said. "There was a time I could not have imagined this house filled with such easy joy. It seemed, when I first arrived, like a place built entirely of careful distance and cold formality." "You changed that," Sebastian said simply. Long before I ever proposed, you had already begun transforming this house into something warmer, simply by refusing to let me hide behind my old walls." Her father approached them then, looking considerably more at ease than Eleanor had seen him in years, a glass of wine in hand and genuine contentment written across his weathered features. "This is a fine gathering, Eleanor," he said. "Your mother would have been proud, I think, to see this house filled with such warmth." "Thank you, Father," Eleanor said, and found she meant the sentiment entirely, without the old bitterness that had once colored so many of their exchanges. As the afternoon stretched into evening and lanterns were lit along the garden paths to guide guests through the gathering dusk, Eleanor found a quiet moment to slip away toward the edge of the lawn, where Charlotte stood watching her daughter finally tire and settle against her skirts. "You have built something remarkable here, Miss Eleanor," Charlotte said, still using the old address out of habit, though Eleanor had told her many times it was no longer necessary. "I do not think I have seen this county so at ease in all the years I have lived in it." "We built it together," Eleanor said, settling beside her old friend. "You and Sebastian, and even my father, in his own stumbling way. I could not have done any of this alone." "Perhaps not," Charlotte agreed, "but it took your courage, that night 3 years ago and every day since, to make it possible at all." Eleanor squeezed her friend's hand gently, watching the lanterns flicker gold against the darkening sky, the sound of laughter and conversation still drifting warmly from the gathered guests behind them. She thought of how far she had traveled from that frightened young woman who had once hidden her hand beneath a glove, terrified of judgment, certain that her courage would only ever be seen as shame. She thought of Sebastian's first question, blunt and unexpected, that had somehow unraveled 3 years of careful concealment and led her, step by uncertain step, toward exactly this moment, a garden full of warmth, a household full of love, and a scar she no longer felt any need to hide. That evening, after the household had settled and the last of the day's business had been attended to, Sebastian found Eleanor in the library, curled into a window seat with a book she had abandoned in favor of watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "You seem thoughtful," he said, joining her at the window, taking the seat across from her. "I was thinking of that first day," Eleanor admitted, "when you asked why I hid my hand. I remember being so frightened, so certain you intended some cruelty by the question, though I could not have imagined then how completely it would change everything that followed." "I remember it too," Sebastian said. "I remember thinking you the most guarded, most fascinating woman I had encountered in years, and being entirely unable to stop myself from wanting to understand what lay beneath that guard. And now that you understand?" "Now," Sebastian said, reaching for her hand, tracing the familiar scar with gentle, affectionate fingers, "I find myself grateful every single day that curiosity got the better of my usual restraint. You have brought more warmth to this house, to this family, to my life, than I ever believed myself capable of experiencing again after Margaret." Eleanor's chest warmed at the mention of a name that no longer carried any sting, only the distant acknowledgement of a painful chapter that had, ultimately, led Sebastian toward the life he now shared with her instead. "I am glad," she said simply, "that we found each other, however unlikely the circumstances." "An apology gone entirely wrong," Sebastian said, a teasing smile touching his lips. "I do not believe your brother ever imagined his foolishness would result in a duke falling in love with his sister." "No," Eleanor agreed, laughing softly. "I do not believe he imagined that at all." They remained in the library as darkness settled fully over the estate, speaking of small, comfortable things, the particular ease of two people who had built their partnership on honesty rather than performance, who had chosen each other not despite their scars but because of the courage those scars represented. Eleanor thought, as she often did in these quiet evening hours, of the frightened young woman who had once arrived at Ashbourne Hall bracing herself for humiliation, and marveled at how thoroughly that fear had transformed, over the course of a single remarkable year, into something steady and certain and entirely her own. Later, as they climbed the stairs together toward their shared chambers, Sebastian paused at the top, drawing Eleanor close for a moment beneath the soft glow of the hallway candles. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with your truth, that first difficult day. I do not believe I properly understood, until you arrived in my study trembling and defiant in equal measure, how much I needed someone willing to see past my own carefully guarded walls." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, "for asking the question no one else dared to ask, and for waiting, patiently, until I found the courage to answer it honestly." They stood together in the quiet hallway, two people who had each spent years hiding their deepest wounds, now fully known and fully loved by the other, certain that whatever challenges the years ahead might bring, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything since that first fateful apology, together, honestly, and without a single trace of hidden shame between them. The scar on Eleanor's hand remained, as scars always do, a permanent mark of the night that had changed the course of her life, but it no longer represented something to be hidden or ashamed of. It had become, instead, exactly what Sebastian had first named it, all those months ago, kneeling before her in his study with a gentleness she had never expected from a man the county called cold, proof of courage, worn openly and without apology, for the rest of her days.